Great segue from the last presentation. So yes, I'm a poet and artist, so I'm a creative, but I also work as an archivist and librarian preserving the histories of creatives from the past, specifically in the 20th century. And I work at the New York Public Library. And that's one of the interests I have in Zhvandun. When I was working at the library, we have a very extensive Islamic and Middle East collection, but very few material on Afghanistan. And I came across our copy of Zhvandun because I was exposed to, as mentioned in the previous talk, of the digitization by the Library of Congress of the 70s issues. At NYPL, what we have is 15 bound books of the 60s era of Zhvandun. These have not been digitized. And I found it fascinating as a visual document, and also going to community events and talking to my family and also sort of the elders at weddings, bringing up the name Zhvandun. You could just visibly see that it unlocked conversation with, I think, a lot of members of my family who don't really talk about that era in Afghanistan, who've sort of come out of the country and live in the diaspora and sort of are focused on the future, that it unlocked so much for them. So it's one of the reasons that really intrigued me on doing this sort of breakdown of these 60s issues of Zhvandun. And just about bibliographic research, so it's the study not of the content necessarily of books or magazines, but of the way it's been made. So what paper was used, where the paper was made, where was the ink made, where was it bound and put together, and how was it put together. And the thing about early 20th century material is that it is made on horrible, very low quality paper. And so while we will have medieval manuscripts that exist far beyond our lives, a lot of this stuff from the early 20th century is already disintegrating. And the copies of Zhvandun that I was looking at, every time I opened it, I feel like I crumbles, like there's just book crumbs all over the place. And so there's this sense of like urgency and the sort of disappearance of a lot of this material. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is 3 different aspects of what I'm looking at. One is just the general research into the print history of the magazine, examining the formatting and type design and et cetera of the magazine, because it's what's also very interesting for a government funded magazine is that it's very zine-like. It's very experimental in the way that it's formatted, which also very much intrigued me. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about 2 or 3 aspects of its content that I think could inspire future research. And if anyone wants to come to NYPL and look at these copies of Zhvandun, I'm more than happy to make sure that happens, because I want there to be better access to this material. So just talking generally about the researching the print history of Zhvandun, I began going through issues looking for names of contributors, names of the writers of each of the articles, and any kind of indication about the printing houses that were used. And in this process, I found this amazing article in a 1962 issue talking about where is Zhvandun printed. And in the article, they talk about how the printing house, Matbaa Dawlati, is the oldest and biggest printing house in Kabul, government printing house, with about 400 people working at the institution, and they talk about how hard all these people work there and how they're able to print about 50,000 sheets every day. And it's not just Zhvandun that's published here. It's other magazines as well, like Kabul magazine. And they also talk a lot about, so I've done a full translation of this article, and I'm hoping to have it published soon. They talk a lot about how they've made branches all over Afghanistan of these printing houses and how they're going to start printing and sort of spreading this information. And another aspect of why I found the 60s issues interesting is it's really that Zaire Shah era that I think a lot of Afghan Americans who've left a sort of romanticized, that sort of Zahir Shah era. So examining sort of the language used and sort of the subtext of how they're trying to define themselves, or how the government is trying to define, as mentioned in the last lecture, about, just trying to define what their idea of being Afghan is in a sort of progressive way. And so, what else? Oh, so what's interesting about this article, about Matbaa Dawlati, is they talk about how 3 years ago there was a fire, so in the late 50s, and everything in the printing house was burned. They say that there was nothing left but the skeleton and the walls, the skeleton of the house. They say the machines were destroyed, that anything on the printing presses were burned, and that there was this great sorrow attached to it. And that even though 3 years ago everything burned, they were able to not miss a single publication of Zhvandun, that they kept going, and that there was, even though there was this great sorrow for people who loved reading and who loved literature, they were able to get it back and running through their just sheer force of, passion. In it, they name the head of the printing press, who, if anyone knows anything else about, I'd love to, again, I'm really just starting this research and trying to crowdsource as much information about anyone who worked on the magazine in any of its periods, or who was in the magazine. And also if anyone has a copy, let me know. I will get some grant money and purchase it and digitize it. So in one of the issues, it also talks more about Matbaa Dawlati. And I don't know if this is the only place Zhvandun was printed, if there were other printing houses in Kabul in this period or earlier. So Zhvandun started in the late 1940s, and I'd love to get my hands on some of those issues of the magazine. There doesn't seem to be a lot of copies that I can access. In America, there's some at NYPL, and then of course Library of Congress has a few issues, but I haven't been able to locate that early sort of era of the magazine. But in this magazine, there's this beautiful photograph of the people who work at the printing house, and so you can see a lot of the workers there. And then also I've been trying to find where exactly the printing house was, so I have these maps of about 1965 Kabul. So this one is a tourist map, which is not very detailed, but it kind of gives you an idea of the landscape. And then the other is more of a, from 1971, city plan that sort of was government issued, and there's very questionable things about how it names certain places. But from my understanding, and the people I've talked to, the printing house was by the post office, just about below Hotel Kabul. So I have some idea of where it was located. And I don't have the names of anyone in this photograph, really. So that's another thing that I'm trying to dissect. But it's great that we have this. And also the people who worked on the magazine changed a lot. I know that there was about 5 people in the 60s that worked on it full time. But other than that, it says that they would hire about 20 students to work on the magazine. I am, however, able to find the machine that it was printed on, because there was a photograph of it, which is great. In one of the issues, it shows this image of them printing the cover of Zhvandun on a 3-color printer, is what they call it, or press, which was quite popular for 20th century magazines in color. You'd print sort of 3 layers of color. You'd print it 3 times, and you get this rich color. And I was able from this image to realize that it was probably a multi-lith offset printing machine, which is very common. It's very cheap. It's a very quick way of sort of printing. And I can also verify that it was printed multiple times, because if you look at Zhvandun, especially the 60s versions, it's not exactly aligned perfectly, because they run it a couple times. So they run the text, and then they run the photographs, and then they do some other copy and paste for photographs or illustrations. And so everything's just a little off-center, and you kind of can see how quick that specific copy of the magazine was printed, if it was one of the first ones that's a bit more neater, or if they were rushing a little bit and it's one of the later versions of it. And also, on my left, you can see people assembling the magazine and those covers of the magazine with those images of women on the wall. So I'm working through this sort of finding any information within the magazine about its printing history, how it was printed, where the printing houses were located. I'm not sure about the paper. It changes. So the early 60s is printed on a very sort of thick, cheap paper though that kind of paper is now very brittle. And then the later issues are a bit more silkier. And so I'm wondering where it could have been printed, if they were buying paper from Pakistan or India, or if there was actually paper mills that they were outsourcing this information, outsourcing this material from. But a little bit about the formatting and type design. It's one of the things that's so beautiful and fascinating about Zhvandun is like the graphic design in it is so beautiful and interesting. And I mentioned that multi-printing, right? So you print the same page more than once. So you have the text, and then you have language over it in a different material. And then also copy and paste, taking photographs and cutting them and putting them on top, and then printing them again. So it's being run through so many times. And again, this is very much common in zines or in sort of small community magazines in the West. And it's so interesting to see it being done in this sort of experimental style in sort of a more official institutional magazine. And I think I may know who one of the graphic designers are, but I'm not verified on that. And I'm sure it changed, but that's one of the other things, finding out who was doing all this sort of experimental design work. And also, yes, like this layering of images, like there is a section on poetry or poems about kissing, so baiser. And so you have this very Western image of two people kissing, and then over it you have the poems. And that's another thing that's very interesting about the 60s era of the magazine, is that some of the iconography is quite Western. Like it's not images of Afghans or even done in a sort of more Asian style. It's like, I wonder if they were buying old woodcuts or illustrations or images and then repurposing them, like especially with the one on the left. The image of the houses are quite Western, and you have a neoclassical building, and then you have the sort of written in Farsi. And so I wonder if they were taking old woodcuts and carving them and changing them. So I'm interested to see where they were purchasing a lot of this material from. And then you have like crosswords and interesting riddle pages. So just the makeup of the magazine is quite interesting. And again, some more of those woodcuts and that layering technique of just having images that are illustrations and then deep pink on one side. And it's very unusual. So I will talk a little bit about the content because it's so hard not to, and it's so rich, especially in the 60s era, where this hasn't been digitized, so I know people haven't seen it. So the advertisements, which were mentioned before, these are just 3 that I pulled out from the 1962 issues that I found very fascinating. Specifically the one in the middle for Rimal products. I find this interesting because I think in Farsi, Rimal we say for mascara, but the house of Rimal was a fashion house like Dior in Paris. And because it was so prevalent in the Middle East, it became sort of a catchword for the word mascara. So it's like as if we were saying Dior for skirts or something. And this specific issue also has English. This specific advertisement, I should say, has English on it as well. And it says that you can purchase this makeup or these shoes, what does it say? Across from or close to Park Cinema, opposite Shorenau Mosque. So you it's interesting to build a sort of map of where all these houses and sort of storefronts were in the 60s. There is in the 60s a lot of interviews and sort of almost like overviews of the great talents in Kabul. So there's a lot of articles on singers and actors. And so this is from a section on the best singers where they were interviewed. So they're question and answer text. And so this one's on Marwan Parwani, who is quite famous for being the first female singer to be heard on Kabul radio with her song Gul Flourished. And in this article, they're asking, and it's also like, what a beautiful young photo of her too. They ask her about singing and who her favorite singers are, and she talks a lot about how, no one taught me how to sing, and at 3 years old, I started singing and trying to make money from it. And so it's an interesting document to see how, what the creators of the magazine deemed as like important, and who they were trying to spotlight in defining this kind of idea of what modern Kabul was in the 60s. And so this is fascinating. They also have, I didn't included one on stage actresses or actresses who were doing dramas in Kabul in the 60s. And they interviewed, and they have photographs of all the actors and actresses and sort of interviewing them in their own words, right? So it's a great document for that kind of information on creatives. Another thing that I found interesting is in one of the issues, they have Jamil Buhird, I think is how you pronounce it, as their cover. So not necessarily an actress or this sort of Western image of, it's a revolutionary from Algeria. So she is quite a famous Algerian activist and militant. She was arrested. There's so much romanticization of her as well. There's an Egyptian film about her called Jamila the Algerian. And so she is the cover of one of the issues of Zhvandun right as the Algerians gain independence from France. And so in the magazine, in the article, it talks about how now Algeria is going to be its own independent state. And they talk about her, and they refer to her as the resilient or tough girl. And it's interesting the way it's written. It kind of echoes this idea of like the female folk heroine, and which is common in sort of thinking about Afghanistan's history gaining independence from the British. So it was just such an unusual, so the 60s is a very interesting time. There's also so many articles about the celebration of Jashn-e Afghanan and how they're really trying to build this idea of like independence and like what post British rule Afghanistan is. And so it's interesting to see the language they use to talk about things, and to have her on the cover of one of their magazines is interesting as well. And so then just generally about what I'm looking into now is reviewing these 60s copies. It's a lot of material to go through, and I'm doing it by hand. And then also the 70s have been digitized, which is amazing, but like finding anything from the 50s or 40s is the next kind of what I'm looking for, and I will travel near and far to access it. And then also building this like list of all the people who worked on the magazine, the network, right? The publishers, people written about, people who wrote for it. And sometimes in the 60s issues, you have these pages where it says who were some of the writers of the magazine, which is incredible. So sort of dictating that, going through it page by page. And then also interviewing it. So I am an archivist by trade, and so I'm very interested not in the preservation of material, but making it accessible to the public in a way that they can intake it, and is easy for them. So starting to interview anyone I know who worked on the magazine or who was in it, and I have a few sources in America, so I'm starting those interviews now just to hear these stories and do this sort of oral history project. Documenting it, because I think not only is the material disintegrating quite quickly, a lot of the people who grew up in this era of Afghanistan they're older, and a lot of them have passed on, and there aren't much of them left, and if we don't document or hear from them now, we might lose those stories for the future, because some of that material is also disappearing. Like, it's amazing that I showed someone like an older woman an image of a park, and then she told me this long story of context behind it that the magazine didn't include, and then I have access to that. And that's amazing. So just collecting a lot of that information. And then making it accessible, right? Creating findings, finding aids. So I'm thinking of a website perhaps where we give access to all of this, like the oral history interviews, and doing exhibitions where people can come and hold Zhvandun and flip through the pages. Okay, perfect. Yes, because a lot of the people I talk to who do remember it, the first question they ask me is, where did you find this? Or can I touch it? Where is it? Can I look at it? So that's amazing. And so if we can do exhibitions, especially at the library, where we can bring people in to see it, it would be great. So working on those kinds of projects. The other thing I should mention too about when it comes to libraries and sort of gaining access to magazines, a lot of magazines are, the bindings are peeled off and they're bound into these huge books. And a lot of Western institutions bound a lot of the magazines backwards because they don't know which side you start on. So it's very confusing. Some of the pages are in the wrong order. Sometimes there are two sets of the same pages because they ripped it from different magazines and put it together. So that's also just so cumbersome to go through and realize the exact order of the magazine before actually looking at its context. Also, there are pamphlets, government pamphlets on politics in the magazines that are like that you pull out and you open large like a poster. But because the magazines are bound in a book, I can't actually take them out and open them. So those are kind of inaccessible. So there are all these issues that need to be addressed. And with that, thank you so much. And I have my contact information if you'd like to give me information or send me anything you know about Zhvandun or the people who worked on it. And I have a QR code to that 70s digitized versions if you're curious now to take a look at those images. So thank you.
Thank you so much.